This is a lecture that correlates with Chapter 7 of The Real World and the PowerPoint entitled Social Stratification. Chapter 7 is titled Social Class, the Structure of Inequality. And it is a very timely lecture right now because what we're seeing as a result of the COVID crisis is that right now you're highlighting this idea of social inequality and disparate outcomes for members of society. Okay. It's usually easier to teach about social class and social stratification at MCC. At a lot of the institutions that I taught at previously, when I talked about social stratification, when I talked about social inequality, it was almost like it was an exercise in the abstract. Due to the student population at MCC, it's a little bit more real, and especially in the current context where so many of my students right now, you're out there, you're still working, you're considered essential labor, even though you are paid kind of the minimum that you can be paid in our society. So hopefully the information from the lecture will actually help out with the understanding, with comprehending the full extent of the problem. Okay. So starting on slide 2, which is social stratification, I actually define the concept of social stratification. And in it, you're looking at members of a given society being categorized and placed into groups. These groups are then ranked in a hierarchy, with people on the top levels of this hierarchy actually receiving more access to resources and reward than those who are very low on the hierarchy. Okay, so once again, relating to this concept that I've brought to you earlier about social inequality. Okay, so social stratification then basically talking then about the different layers that occur when you are talking about social inequality. Social inequality then, just like in chapter 1, if you guys remember, is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and prestige among members of a society. Now, hopefully by now you guys know that this is related to conflict theory as one of the major paradigms, and it is directly related to what we learned in learning Marx's theory. So if it seems unfamiliar to you guys because it's been a very long time since chapter 1, you may want to go back in your notes and quickly review what I lectured about with Marx at that point. But just as a reminder, when you're looking at this idea of social inequality, what Marx argues is we need to strive then for social equality in terms of equal access to resources. Okay. Now, a lot of times when I start talking about social equality, a lot of people are like, well, not everyone can be a doctor. Not everyone can be a CEO. We're not making the argument that everyone is going to end up in the same place. Instead, what we're arguing is that everyone deserves the same right to compete to end up in the same places. Okay, so essentially when you say equal access to resources, you are looking at this idea that people should have adequate food, they should not have to worry about shelter, they should have the same educational resources, right? All of the things necessarily to compete in a capitalist system. Now, what we're currently seeing is the effects of what I say capitalism run amok, right? This idea of extreme social inequality, as right now we have seen millions of laborers being laid off or fired during this crisis, right? We see that minimum wage workers, the ones who are actually considered before all this mess as not unskilled, right, as not valued labor, becoming then essential to the functioning of our everyday lives, just like they were before this crisis. But now there is a recognition that, okay, this is important work that must be done. That is, we're looking at the grocery stores, the hardware stores, the fast food places, the restaurants in terms of keeping things running, right? Can even make the argument right now with social inequality The people cleaning the hospitals are just as valuable and needed as the doctors at this point, but we have a tendency not to see labor in that way. So what happens in terms of an equal distribution of wealth, power, and prestige? We're seeing individuals who work incessantly not being able to pay their rent or to buy food right now at the same time as these corporations are being bailed out with trillions of dollars. Okay. So when it comes to social stratification, you really do need to keep a macro lens on the topic. Okay, so on slide number 4, I give you the basic principles of social stratification. There are 4 that you need to know for the class. The first principle of social stratification, then, it's a characteristic of society, not of individual effort. And so, like I said before, take a macro lens. Instead of focusing on the individual, you look at it as a system. Right? You look at it as a societal system rather than just the individual. I already told you guys my pet peeve when in America is when you are talking about things like poverty and wealth. Generally, the kind of thing that you hear most often is get a job, go to college, right? It's a very simplistic argument because what I'm going to prove to you guys now is that having a job actually doesn't work out in terms of the math, that going to college definitely doesn't work out in terms of the math right now. Instead, what we say is that social stratification is a societal level problem, not a reflection of individual effort. So evidence of that is the second bullet point that I give you guys, which is that social stratification then, what rank you exist in actually persists through generations. So there is a cycle that is involved when you look at this idea of wealth and poverty. And it makes sense if you think about it in that way, because if you have money, then it's easier to live in a school district where you have ample resources, right? It is definitely advantageous if you never have to worry about food on your table or where you live, etc. And the example I give of this is really, really basic, which is in some of the suburban school districts. So I live in the burbs, you already know that. Everyone from 6th through 12 already had a Chromebook issued by the school before all this happened. Now, in that case, right before classes went online, my kid's school basically said, well, make sure to take home your Chromebook and all of your books. Now, you can see that in some of the other school districts that don't have these resources, distance learning is going to then become a huge issue. Okay, so second basic principle is that it persists through generations because where you come from in terms of your family actually really strongly influences your life chances. The third is that different societies have different criteria for ranking, that in the United States, we exist off of a system called social class, which I will go into in detail later. But you also have other countries that work off of different systems. That in India, you have the caste system, where essentially you are born into a strata and there is no going up or going down in it. It's actually kind of illegal if you marry someone from a different caste and try to be together in that way. So the fourth basic principle of social stratification goes back to a concept that I've been going on over and over about this semester. Social inequality is maintained and justified by the mainstream beliefs of a culture. And those of you who are paying attention throughout all the other lectures are like, oh, this is where she starts talking about the American dream theory and about cultural hegemony again. Okay? Because essentially, I've already said it before, that when you look at this idea of fairness, of justice, we kind of do that instinctually. If you see a toddler, if you see a little kid, they are obsessed with things being fair, right? You basically hear kids say all the time, that's not fair. He got more than I did. She got more than I did. And it's this idea that we are kind of inherently obsessed with this idea of justice. Now, if I present all the data to you and say, look at how unfair and unjust our system is, you can say, well, that doesn't make sense because we are actually kind of obsessed with fairness. Goes back to how we tend to think of social stratification. Now, if you are given the argument that it is an individual's problem and that all they have to do is work harder, that all they have to do is become more talented or educated, then once again, you are kind of turning away from the reality of the societal level of the situation rather than looking specifically, right, and saying, okay, well, then just work. You're basically excusing social stratification, social inequality in that way, okay? So the way I learned social stratification, the way a lot of Social 101 classes explain it, is by looking at the Earth's crust. Now, I don't know that much about the Earth's crust, that I leave that to my colleagues in geology. Instead, I know a lot about food. So on slide 5, I give you my analogy for social stratification, which is a stack of pancakes. Okay, so if you look at this picture, it looks like your basic commercial of pancakes where you have, in this case, there's 6 pancakes stacked up together. They're really pretty. They're symmetrical and identical, stacked up on a plate. And just like most ads, there is a pat of butter on the top, and then there's syrup being poured over the top and kind of drizzling down the sides. Okay, I use this analogy because most of us have had pancakes. Now, I'm going to argue that most of us don't eat 6 pancakes at a time, but when they're presented, we always see it that way. What I argue, and I usually take a poll in class, most people don't eat their pancakes that way because it presents a dilemma right away, right? If you have that stack of pancakes and you put everything on that top pancake, generally what happens to that top pancake is that it gets really, really soggy, right? It has so much butter, so much syrup that it actually gets kind of wet and starts disintegrating, right? The idea then is that, well, you're supposed to load up that first pancake and it's all supposed to soak down so that the bottom pancake gets something too. In reality, if you look at 6 pancakes, by the time you get down to that last pancake in the bunch, then it's going to be completely dry. So to extend the analogy, once again, we're not talking about outcomes. We're talking about resources. Most people, like I said, don't eat the stack of pancakes. They actually undo the stack, right? And kind of spread butter and syrup all over all of the pancakes, just so that each pancake has the equal chance of tasting good, right? I'm really extending the analogy right now, but you guys get what I mean. It's that if you actually just kind of do it and say, well, if the top has enough, then it's going to trickle down, you are looking at a very flawed model. Okay, so that is the definition of social stratification and social inequality. I've given you the basic principles of social stratification and my pancake analogy. In part 2, then, I will continue this lecture.